My name is Ivan Tao. I am a licensed corridor auditor, 3rd rank, contracted neutral under Trade Compact Review Code 17, which sounds more impressive than it is. Mostly it means I get sent to the places nobody important wants to visit, I look at the things nobody important wants to notice, and I write reports that become extremely valuable 6 months after the people who should have read them the first time are already in trouble. In 19 years, I have filed 48 incident assessments. I have documented airlock piracy, customs fraud, structural negligence, bribery webs, a religious cargo strike, and one deeply embarrassing diplomatic altercation involving fermented algae liquor and a senator's ceremonial companion animal. I believed, with reasonable professional confidence, that I understood how a bad station behaved. Then I met Elias Vane. And after you meet someone like Elias Vane, every earlier definition of competence begins to feel soft around the edges. But that part only makes sense if I start with the station because the station mattered. Places like this always matter more than people admit while they are still trapped inside them. The station was called Kestral Junction. Calling it a junction was an act of administrative optimism. Kestral hung at the crossing point of 3 minor freight routes and one old survey lane that still appeared on official charts out of courtesy rather than use. No passenger line advertised it. No commercial brochure romanticized it. No government propaganda reel ever showed its exterior silhouette against the stars while a narrator spoke warmly about interspecies cooperation and the promise of frontier trade. Kestral was what happened when infrastructure outlived attention. Its outer hull plating had been patched in 6 visible shades of metal. 2 docking collars sealed properly on the first try, one usually did, and Bay 9 had developed a pressure warning alarm so untrustworthy that the Bay crews no longer reacted unless it failed to go off. The gravity on decks 1 through 3 held steady enough for legal occupancy, which is a phrase only bureaucrats and gamblers use with a straight face. On deck 5, the plating dipped near the eastern corridor in a way that made wheeled cargo drift subtly left unless compensated for. Deck 7 smelled permanently of coolant, solder, and the sort of electrical burn that suggested somebody somewhere had fixed the wrong thing very quickly and then decided to call the result stable. The lighting in the central market ring flickered every 14 seconds. Not approximately. Exactly. The first time I counted it, I assumed coincidence. The second time, I understood I was looking at a fault pattern old enough to qualify as architecture. Kestral had 2,800 permanent residents, maybe 3,000 on paper if you counted the names station management had never removed from old housing rolls because lower population numbers triggered funding reviews no one wanted to survive. It had 1 medical bay, 2 functional cargo lifts, 4 bars, a failed school annex being used as storage, and a water recycling system whose service logs contained enough blank spaces to make any honest inspector start drinking before lunch. And yet it persisted. Stations like Kestral always do. They survive by habit long after they stop deserving confidence. The official station administrator was a Vesk named Horrell Den, who had mastered the rare bureaucratic art of looking exhausted without appearing inactive. He spoke in thoughtful, delayed sentences, approved maintenance requests in batches large enough to obscure responsibility, and maintained a personal theory that every crisis on Kestral would become less immediate if he handled it after 1 meal and 1 nap. This theory had not worked once in the 11 months I had known him. The real power structure, naturally, lay elsewhere. Kestral's informal economy was held together by a syndicate called the Black Spline, which was one of those names chosen specifically so that frightened people would imagine cleverness where there was mostly organization and enough violence to support invoicing. They controlled the undeclared cargo corridors, the side docking permits, 3 warehouse access chains, and the unofficial transit fees that allowed small merchants to keep operating without having their shipments delayed, misplaced, reclassified, or set on fire by coincidence. Their visible representative was a man named Sarek Dahl. I had seen him twice before Elias Vane arrived. Once in the market ring settling a dispute by standing very still while someone else apologized. Once in Dock 6 reviewing manifests that definitely did not match the containers behind them. Sarek was lean, elegant in the way predators sometimes are, and so economically polite that people unfamiliar with criminal ecosystems often misread him as civilized. This mistake, I am told, could be corrected quite rapidly. He had an enforcer named Brome. Brome did not need a surname. Species scholars insist the Brath are a nuanced people with a rich oral tradition, adaptive kin loyalty, and historically complex labor migrations across volcanic worlds. All of this may be true. It is also true that a Brath of Brome's size walking down a narrow service corridor produces a very immediate and unacademic appreciation for scale. He smiled rarely. This improved clarity. I mention all of this because Kestral was not merely broken in the mechanical sense. It was broken in layers. Failing infrastructure, soft administration, predatory informal control, tired workers, trapped merchants, paper systems full of holes, physical systems full of older holes patched with newer lies. That was the station. That was the world into which Elias Vane walked carrying one duffel bag and a cup of stimulant concentrate roughly the size of a coolant canister. He arrived on a cargo shuttle called the Second Attempt, which should have warned everyone. Ships with names like that are either comedy or history. This one turned out to be both. I happened to be in Dock 4 because 3 pallets of audit-tagged ceramic filters had gone missing from a bonded transfer cage, and the local dockmaster was attempting to persuade me that the relevant paperwork had probably migrated into the wrong stack rather than been sold out a side hatch to someone with faster instincts and less regulation. He was midway through this explanation when the shuttle ramp dropped. Most species do not stand out on a place like Kestral unless they are visibly armed, visibly wealthy, or visibly doomed. Humans, contrary to theatrical fiction, are not naturally imposing when you first see them. They are too symmetrical, too expressive in the face, too physically unarmored. On paper they often sound less alarming than they turn out to be. Elias Vane looked tired. Not weak tired. Focused tired. The kind of tired worn by people who have been working too long in too many bad environments and have stopped expecting the next one to be cleaner just because its brochure had access to better ink. Medium height. Dark jacket with more pockets than seemed morally necessary. Hair cut with practical indifference. One bag. One oversized drink in one hand. No entourage. No visible weapon. No effort wasted on posture. What made me look at him twice was not appearance. It was the way he entered the station. He stepped off the ramp and did not do what new arrivals usually do, which is orient around signage, nearest traffic flow, customs desk placement, or the first available exit from the smell. He paused once and looked at the ceiling braces, the cargo lanes, the docking cameras, the 2 visible security stations, the service door near Bay 4's pressure valve housing, and the floor scar where a heavy crate had recently been dragged hard enough to mark plating. Not a tourist look. Not a nervous look. A systems look. The kind of look mechanics, thieves, soldiers, and people who intend to survive tend to share. At the time, I filed it mentally under human quirk. Later, I would reclassify it more accurately as baseline threat assessment disguised as casual observation. He queued at the port desk, produced his contract slate, and requested a 4-week station stay under Infrastructure Service Authority. That caught my attention immediately. Nobody voluntarily requested a month on Kestral unless they were being paid unusually well, hiding from something more dangerous than Kestral, or afflicted with a professional ethic severe enough to qualify as pathology. The port clerk, a sallow Hessan named Murd who moved through most workdays with the spiritual velocity of cooling wax, scanned the authorization twice. Systems restoration consultant? Murd said. Maintenance engineer, the human replied. For weeks. Depends how honest your station schematics are. Murd stared at him. This was, in fairness, the correct response. The human took a drink from the enormous cup. Murd stamped the permit. That was the first exchange anyone on Kestral had with Elias Vane, and in retrospect it contained the whole story in miniature. The station attempted dullness. He replied with precision. The station did not know yet that precision was much more dangerous than aggression. By afternoon the network had done what small stations always do. Everyone knew a human engineer had arrived. Everyone knew he had been hired to overhaul the auxiliary power and environmental control systems. Everyone knew the administration had already failed to hire 3 previous contractors, 2 of whom had quoted prices so high they might as well have been insults and one of whom had apparently walked through the lower utility spine, laughed once in disbelief, and left before invoicing properly. By evening the story had improved in the telling as stories do. The human had come from the rimward salvage belts. The human had rebuilt a water plant during an active mutiny. The human had fixed a refinery on a moon with no atmosphere and worse management. The human had once refused triple pay because the station supervisor had lied to him about the actual condition of the coolant backbone. I confirmed none of these. I did not need to. The important part was already visible. Kestral, which normally absorbed new arrivals without emotional commitment, had become interested. Not impressed. Interest comes first. Impression is usually what follows if you survive long enough to deserve it. The next morning I saw Elias Vane again on Deck 6 outside the auxiliary distribution spine, which is where Kestral kept the machines it could not afford to replace and the smells it could not afford to identify. He was standing with the junior maintenance liaison assigned to him, a narrow-shouldered station tech named Pell, both of them looking up at a 3-story lattice of conduits, relays, patched interfaces, thermal shunts, improvised support braces, and at least one panel that had clearly been secured using a philosophy rather than a compatible fitting. Vane looked at it for maybe 15 seconds. Then he said to no one in particular, "Well, someone kept this alive through force of personality." Pell made the sort of noise people make when they are not sure whether they have been insulted personally. "Is it bad?" he asked. Vane took another drink. "Define bad." That was the moment, I think, the station began sliding quietly into his gravity. Not because he raised his voice. Not because he announced himself. Because he looked at Kestral the way no one else had in years. As a system that could still be understood. And once somebody starts understanding a broken place properly, the broken place becomes dangerous to everyone depending on confusion. I did not speak to Elias Vane on his first day. That was not caution. Not exactly. It was workload. My missing ceramic filters had become 12 missing ceramic filters after an inventory reconciliation on Dock 2 revealed that the original count had been optimistic in the way station counts often are when too many people benefit from numbers staying soft around the edges. By the time I finished arguing with cargo control, the day had tipped into station night, and Deck 4 was lit in its usual bruise-colored sequence of dim market strips, emergency guidelines, and one advertisement panel for synthetic citrus drink that flickered so badly it appeared to be losing faith in its own product. Kestral at night smelled like hot wiring, recycled air, protein grease, and fatigue. This is not a poetic statement. It is literal fact. Some stations have a recognizable atmosphere because their environmental systems work well enough to produce consistency. Kestral had a recognizable atmosphere because the same failures had been circulating through the ducts for so long that they had become cultural. I stopped in the food hall because the body, unlike principle, often insists on being maintained. The food hall occupied one crescent of Deck 4 and offered 6 categories of disappointment, one of which advertised itself as nutritionally complete. The kindest thing I can say about that line is that it reflected admirable confidence. That was where I saw him again. He was standing at the counter of a drink stall run by a Triani woman named Vesk, who had once threatened to break a customs broker's fingers one by one because he accused her of watering down concentrate. The accusation had been false. Her memory was not. Vane was looking at the dispenser array with serious attention, like a man studying options in a tactical emergency. Vesk crossed 2 upper arms. "I can sell you 1 standard station cup or 1 large." He pointed at a vessel near the back shelf that was absolutely not part of the visible menu. "That one. That is for staff." I am willing to respect that emotionally while ignoring it practically. Vesk stared at him for a beat. Then, to my astonishment, she laughed. A real laugh. Brief, sharp, involuntary. "Station maintenance?" she said. "Engineering contract. That explains the eyes." She reached for the oversized container. "What's in it?" "Hopefully enough." She filled it with a dark stimulant blend used primarily by night shift mechanics and one category of people trying not to make a bad decision worse by sleeping first. He paid without complaint. That, in itself, marked him as foreign. Everyone else on Kestral complained as reflex, even when the complaint changed nothing. Especially when it changed nothing. He turned with the drink, noticed there were no open tables, and simply remained standing at the edge of the room while reviewing something on a tablet held one-handed. The cup was large enough that his forearm had to support it from below. I watched him for longer than neutrality strictly required. Partly because humans remained unusual this far out. Partly because competence has visible posture if you know how to look for it. Partly because he was reading station schematics while drinking enough caffeine to temporarily separate his spirit from his body, and I respect consistency in a professional. He looked, I decided, like a man built around tasks. Not ambition. Not display. There is a kind of person who moves through systems asking what can be gained from them. There is another kind who moves through systems asking what is broken. The second kind is rarer. The second kind is usually more disruptive. The next morning confirmed it. Pell, the station tech assigned to shadow him, found me outside the bonded records room on Deck 3 with the wide-eyed expression of someone who had recently watched a magician dismantle a religion using only common tools. "What happened?" I asked. "He looked at the auxiliary spine," Pell said. I waited. Pell blinked, as if the sentence should have contained enough explanatory force by itself. And then he told me the upper relay bank had been overheating for at least 5 weeks, that one tertiary load branch was wired backward, that the lower junction housing had been opened by someone using the wrong tool in a hurry, and that the left side support coupler was going to fail inside 12 days unless we shut that section down manually before the system did it for us. I considered this. Did he test any of it? He pointed. That was all Pell said for a moment. Then, with the solemn confusion of a person describing something that still offended his preferred understanding of reality, he added, then he opened 3 panels in order and all of it was true. I found Vane on deck 6 an hour later. He had turned one section of the engineering bay into something between a workshop and an autopsy theater. Tools arranged with geometric exactness. Access panels stacked by removal order. Relay housings tagged. 2 portable diagnostic rigs running on different frequencies. 1 wall screen showing live load data from the auxiliary grid in enough layered colors to frighten any honest station administrator into early retirement. Pell was holding a thermal scanner and trying very hard not to ask too many questions too quickly. Vane was halfway inside a junction cluster with one shoulder and both hands when I approached. He heard my steps or perhaps simply noticed the change in airflow. Give me 30 seconds, he said without looking up. No ceremonial pause. No, why are you here? Just a time estimate, as if all interactions should begin with correct expectations. At exactly 27 seconds he backed out, set a scorched relay coupler on the work surface and looked at me. Close up, he still did not seem especially heroic. That was part of the effect. Humans in stories are usually drawn as if the body must advertise the plot in advance. Vane looked like a man who had been sleeping badly in technical spaces for years and had accepted this as an occupational climate. You're the auditor, he said. Not a question. I inclined my head. Ivan Tal. Elias Vane. I gathered. He glanced toward the live grid feed. Did Pell already tell everyone I can identify negligence by scent? Pell made an offended noise in the background. I did not say scent. You implied scent. You said the lower relay housing smelled like old panic and overheated insulation. It did. He said this with complete seriousness. I felt, against my will, the beginning of amusement. Are you always this direct? I asked. Only when the machinery deserves honesty. He took the thermal scanner from Pell, checked one rising node temperature and passed it back. The motion was efficient enough to suggest deep repetition. Not merely skill. Practice. I looked over the workstation. 3 previous firms refused this contract, I said. That tracks. And yet you accepted it. He shrugged one shoulder. Someone has to go to the bad stations. There are lines that sound better later because the later context gives them weight. This was one of them. At the time it felt merely practical. A sentence shaped like the man saying it. I asked, you prefer work like this? He looked at the spine. Then at the access panel in his hands. Then at the diagnostics. Only after that at me. I prefer necessary work, he said. That answer did more for his myth than any boast could have. Because it implied hierarchy. Not of money. Not prestige. Necessity. Stations like Kestral had no shortage of people attracted to leverage, profit, position, escape velocity. Necessary work attracted a much smaller and stranger class of mind. Pell, who still had not adjusted to the fact that the contractor assigned to him could apparently read burn patterns like literature, gestured uncertainly at the upper relay map. He said this section has been patched with incompatible couplers from 3 different manufacturers, Pell told me. Vane corrected him immediately. 4. Pell frowned. I thought 3. There are 3 visible manufacturers, Vane said. The 4th is the one hidden under the insulation wrap because whoever did the patch knew they were committing a technical sin and wanted fewer witnesses. He said it while already moving back toward the panel. Again dryly. No flourish. That was becoming his signature. Competence without performance. It is a dangerous combination because it removes the usual warning sounds. Loud people prepare you. Vane did not. He slid the panel back into place and tapped 2 lines of annotation into his tablet. I noticed then that his notes were extremely compact, almost architectural in the spacing. A person who expected to revisit them later and wanted his future self to remain able to trust his past self. I respect that in any species. Pell lowered his voice once Vane had shifted to the next cluster. He hasn't slept much, Pell said. How much? 4 hours maybe. Maybe less. I looked at the oversized stimulant container on the edge of the workstation. It had been refilled. Concerning, I said. Pell nodded. He says it's temporary. Do you believe him? Pell considered the question honestly. I believe he believes it. That was a better answer than most people manage. For the next 3 days, Elias Vane became impossible not to hear about. Not because he sought attention. Because stations talk. Bad stations especially. In places with too little structure, information behaves like moisture. It gets into everything. By second shift on day 2, The market ring knew the human engineer had predicted a thermal cascade on Deck 6 down to the minute. By evening, Dock 3 had the improved version, in which he had prevented an explosion by glaring at a relay hard enough that it reconsidered its choices. By morning of day 3, one of the food vendors was claiming he could identify hidden wiring faults through walls by listening to the vibration of overhead lamps. This last one I knew to be false. He was not listening to lamps. He was listening to load delay in the lines beyond them. There is a difference. I know because I asked him. He was in the service lift at the time, shoulders braced around a crate of replacement couplers, when the lift lurched half a meter and then recovered with the embarrassing determination of elderly machinery refusing humiliation in public. He glanced up at the ceiling plate. Deck 5 relay crossover, he said. I stared at him. You can hear that? I can hear the delay. The lift shuddered again. He shifted the crate slightly higher. Also, the lift motor bearing is misaligned. I said, you haven't seen the motor. I don't need to. Then, after a second, because apparently some small piece of him believed in kindness, it's not talent. It's repetition. That was perhaps the most revealing thing he said all week. He did not mythologize himself. Even his gifts, if gifts they were, he described as accumulated labor. The effect of this on Kestral was subtle at first. Then not subtle at all. The station began orienting around him. Maintenance workers rerouted their brakes to pass Deck 6. A market gossip chain emerged devoted entirely to tracking how many stimulant refills he consumed per shift. One cargo handler started taking bets on whether Vane would repair the flickering market lights without being asked, purely because he seemed like the kind of person who might consider the issue spiritually offensive. More importantly, the people who relied on Kestral remaining half dead had started noticing him too. I know because I saw Brome in the market corridor on day 4 watching the engineering access feed on a stolen monitor with the expression of a large animal evaluating whether an unfamiliar tool had just become a weapon. He noticed me noticing him. We both chose professionalism and looked away. That was the first sign that Elias Vane had stopped being merely a contractor. He had become a variable. And on places like Kestral, variables are what transform neglect into consequence. By day 5, Elias Vane had developed 3 reputations on Kestral Junction. The first was among maintenance crews who regarded him with the wary respect technicians reserve for people who can look at a failing system for 12 seconds and then tell you which part will try to kill you first. The second was among market vendors, who had decided he survived primarily on stimulant concentrate, compressed protein, and irritation. The third, less public but more important, was among the station's informal power networks, who had begun asking the same question in a half-dozen different rooms. Why is the engineer still here after seeing how bad it is? That question matters on places like Kestral. Most people, when confronted with a broken system large enough to ruin their week and vague enough to ruin their month, react in one of 3 ways. They panic. They negotiate with reality. Or they lower their standards until continued function becomes a philosophical rather than technical category. Elias Vane did none of those. He opened panels. He took notes. He made unpleasantly accurate predictions. And every time something proved him right, the station reorganized itself 1 degree further around his existence. I spent enough time on Deck 6 that week to observe the pattern directly, though if anyone asks in an official setting, I continue to maintain that I was there for document verification and transport audit reconciliation. This is technically true. It is simply not the whole truth. The auxiliary distribution spine occupied the western half of Deck 6 and looked, to the untrained eye, like what would happen if a power grid had been designed by committee, maintained by opportunists, and repaired over 20 years by frightened pragmatists using whatever components happened to be physically nearest during the crisis. Which, Pell informed me, was not far from the historical record. 3-story conduit stacks rose into shadow. Relay housings had been color-coded at some point in the distant past, then recoded, then partially stripped, then annotated in marker by at least 4 generations of increasingly desperate workers. Several panels had labels that contradicted the systems behind them. One critical junction had a handwritten note that simply read "Do not trust" readout with no date or signature. Vane took this in the way a surveyor takes in a river delta. Not as chaos. As information. That was the strange part. He never looked overwhelmed. Annoyed sometimes. Deeply unconvinced by earlier work, certainly. Sleep-deprived almost always. But not overwhelmed. He moved through the station's infrastructure as if every stupid patch, every overheating node, every undocumented bypass and mislabeled relay was another sentence in a language he was perfectly fluent in and mildly tired of translating for the rest of us. On the morning of day 5, Pell showed up with 3 replacement coupling housings, a crate of thermal sealant, and the expression of a man bracing for educational violence. Vane was already there. Of course he was. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor beneath the lower junction bank with his back against a tool crate, one hand around the largest legal stimulant container I had yet seen in his possession, the other holding a schematic pad. He did not look up when Pell approached. "Deck 3 load branch is lying to us," he said. Pell stopped short. "Good morning to you too." "Good morning," Vane said. "Deck 3 branch telemetry is underreporting by 4.2%. That's why the market ring lights pulse every 14 seconds instead of failing outright." Pell blinked. "You got that from the overnight logs?" "No." Vane took a drink. "I got it from the fact the pulse interval is exact." Then he finally looked up. If it were random degradation, the interval would drift. Exact intervals mean compensation behavior. Compensation behavior means some part of the system knows it's failing and is trying to preserve continuity. Which would be admirable if it weren't also deeply annoying. He stood, took one coupling housing from Pell without checking the label, and moved toward the central relay trunk. Watching him work was unnerving in the way all real expertise is unnerving. Not because it looks mystical. Quite the opposite. Mysticism is easy to dismiss. Real expertise is dangerous because it looks ordinary while producing results that make everyone else feel suddenly underqualified for their own lives. He would glance at a burn mark and infer timing. Touch one section of casing and estimate thermal strain. Listen to a relay cycle and say, "That one was repaired during an emergency by someone with good instincts and no ethics," as if that were a standard diagnostic category. Once, around midday, he stopped in front of a high relay cluster, squinted, and said, "Whoever put this in was either a genius improviser or running on 2 hours of sleep in divine panic." Pell, who had by then developed the survival skill of translating Vane into station language, craned his neck upward. "Can you tell which?" Vane considered. "Both probably." He climbed the ladder. 10 minutes later he was holding up a non-standard coupler assembly that had clearly been modified by force, intelligence, and moral compromise. "I owe someone from 8 years ago an apology," he said. "For what?" Pell asked. "For assuming this kind of work was always bad." He turned the coupler over in his hand. "Sometimes it's just desperate." That line stayed with me, though I did not know why until later. Because it told me something important about him. He did not romanticize broken systems. But neither did he mistake every bad fix for bad faith. That distinction separates experts from zealots. By second shift the market ring had received updated rumor versions of his skill set. The corridor repair crew from Deck 5 had decided he could identify electrical faults by smell. A cargo registrar claimed he had predicted a relay spark to within 3 seconds. One of the bar runners from the lower commercial belt told me, with absolute confidence, that the human had stared at a malfunctioning panel until it admitted the truth. This last version had, admittedly, drifted from strict engineering methodology. Still, the emotional content was correct. The station had begun treating him less like hired labor and more like a force being expressed through hired labor. That same afternoon I found him in the market ring standing under one of the flickering light strips with his cup in one hand and a handheld scanner in the other. He was not scheduled to be there. I knew because I had asked Pell for his work itinerary that morning under the honorable pretense of ensuring clear audit passage through repair zones. Vane tilted the scanner toward the light panel, frowned once, and then looked not at the fixture but at the power trunk behind the wall. "Deck 3 relay undercompensates when corridor load spikes," he said aloud to no one. A vendor 2 stalls over, without pausing his serving line, said, "Can you make it stop doing that?" Vane looked at the lights, then at the crowd flow, then at the wall panel. "Yes," he said. The vendor blinked. "Right now." "No, a beat. Soon." That was the other dangerous thing about him. He answered as if the world were alterable. Many people on Kestral had forgotten that basic premise. Later, back on Deck 6, Pell finally asked the question everyone else had been circling for days. "Why did you take this contract?" Vane kept working while he answered. "Because the station sent a full diagnostics packet." Pell frowned. "That's why. That's rare." He removed a scorched contact plate and laid it aside in a tray already sorted by failure type. "Most places like this lie on the first document," he said. "They downgrade the severity, omit the dangerous parts, hide the budget reality, and imply the system is mostly stable except for 1 or 2 manageable problems." Kestral sent actual numbers. He paused. "Bad numbers? But honest ones." Pell looked genuinely puzzled. "So you came because the station was honest?" "I came because the station was honest about being in trouble," Vane said. He glanced sideways at Pell. There's a difference. That answer did not, I suspect, make complete sense to Pell. It made perfect sense to me. Places like Kestral do not earn loyalty through beauty, comfort, or legitimacy. They sometimes earn it through the much rarer virtue of honestly admitting how close they are to failure. By evening of day 5, I had enough of the pattern to begin worrying in a more structured way. Not about the grid. Oddly enough, the grid now seems safer. I was worried about what happened next whenever a person like Elias Vane had been on a station long enough to stop merely diagnosing it and start understanding its hidden geometry. Because Kestral's infrastructure did not end at wiring. It ran through transit corridors, manifest gaps, power theft, blocked inspection routes, criminal storage rooms, ghost permits, bribed clerks, overworked techs, frightened merchants, and sleeping administrators. A station is just a set of dependencies with docking clamps. And Vane, I had begun to suspect, was the sort of human who could not look at one dependency for very long without noticing the others attached to it. That was confirmed the next morning. I arrived on deck 6 with a signed release notice for my missing ceramic filters, miraculously rediscovered in a bonded side inventory after what cargo control described as an internal cross-placement event, by which they meant theft complicated by paperwork, and found Pell sitting on an overturned crate with the expression of someone spiritually outpaced. Vane was 3 meters away, half inside an open panel, talking quietly to the grid. Not metaphorically. Actually talking. Okay, he said, voice muffled by the housing. That's an interesting choice. Bad but interesting. Pell saw me and pointed with the helpless dignity of a man who had run out of explanatory framework. He does this now. Now. Apparently always. From inside the panel Vane said, I can hear both of you. You're talking to the station, Pell said. I'm talking to the repair history. He backed out, holding a small blackened relay bridge between 2 fingers. Whoever installed this used 3 incompatible systems and 1 homemade thermal buffer. Which means they either had no budget, no proper parts, or no expectation of living long enough for standards to matter. He set it gently into a separate tray. Pell looked at the tray labels. I leaned slightly to read them too. They were, in order: predictable failure, preventable stupidity, panic, improvisation, surprisingly elegant under pressure. The scorched bridge went into the 4th tray. I stared at it. Then at him. You categorize the entire grid? Not yet, he said. Only the parts that matter immediately. That was when I understood what made him so effective. He did not merely know how systems worked. He knew how people failed inside systems. And he had built a working method around the distinction. The grid, in his mind, was already becoming a map of human and non-human behavior. Shortcuts, fear, competence, neglect, ingenuity, pressure, damage, survival. He was not repairing hardware. He was reading a civilization in burn patterns. And on a station where the official version of things was wrong almost by design, a person who could do that was going to cause consequences. I simply did not yet know how many. The official version of Kestral Junction was contained in 7 public schematics, for administrative overlays, 3 repair maps so old they still referenced departments that no longer existed, and 1 master systems diagram that the station office continued distributing to contractors because nobody in management possessed the emotional stamina to admit it had become fiction. The real station lived elsewhere. It lived in timing. In access. In who could move a crate at second shift without being stopped and who could not. In which corridors stayed technically public but became functionally private after lights out. In which power drains appeared on the books as refrigeration, transit, or environmental load, and which of those labels were being asked, politely but firmly, to lie on behalf of more profitable arrangements. Elias Vane discovered this the same way he discovered everything else on Kestral. By trying to do his job correctly. The initial collision point was a conduit route. That is often how larger trouble begins. Not with ideology or high policy or dramatic betrayal. With a line on a map that should have been clear and wasn't. The auxiliary stabilization sequence for decks 3 through 6 required physical access to 4 relay breakpoints so the old balancing logic could be stripped out and replaced with something that did not treat emergency overdraw like a lifestyle. 3 of those breakpoints were in standard maintenance zones. 1 was inside Storage Annex 12 on the lower midline. Storage Annex 12 was, according to the station registry, an underused freight holding room assigned to general overflow and minor bonded delay. This was not true. Pell told Vane it was not true in the tone station workers use when explaining weather. That room belongs to the black spline, he said. They were standing in the lower service corridor outside the sealed access door. The paint around the frame had blistered years ago from repeated thermal stress, and someone had once tried to make the area look more official by mounting a faded restricted access placard above the control panel. The placard now hung slightly crooked, which felt thematically correct. Vane looked at the door. Then at the conduit readout on his tablet. Then at Pell. I filed an access request yesterday. Pell made the smallest possible expression of sympathy. Then you will probably receive silence on it by tomorrow. I marked it maintenance priority. That only changes which pile it goes missing from. Vane considered this without visible irritation, which by then I had learned was one of his more alarming traits. Other people got angry at obstruction. He grew attentive. Black spline, he said. Explain. Pell glanced down the corridor before answering, not because anyone was there, but because on stations like Kestral the habit of checking for listeners becomes part of your skeleton. They control the undeclared freight routes, the after-hours transit, some warehouse access, some protection payments. Most of the things station management pretends are temporary complications rather than a parallel governance structure. Vane absorbed this. And Annex 12? Used for cargo they don't want scanned in public. That seems like poor placement for a station conduit break. Pell looked at him. For one ambitious second I thought he might laugh. Instead he said, that is the most innocent possible interpretation of the problem. I was there because I had come to Deck 6 to get a signature on a transport clearance and found them both arguing gently with the door as if it might eventually become reasonable. Neutral auditors acquire excellent instincts for standing nearby when systems begin interacting badly. Vane tapped the access pad again. No response. He waited the length of one thoughtful breath, then knocked. This was, I think, the moment I first understood that he treated every obstacle as a solvable interface until proven otherwise. The door opened partway. A Hessan I did not know looked out with the heavy-lidded annoyance of someone performing low-level criminal work on too little sleep. We're closed, he said. It's a conduit junction, Vane replied, holding up his tablet. Auxiliary grid bypass. I need 20 minutes. The Hessan looked at the tablet as if information technology had insulted him personally. Wrong door. No, Vane said, correct door. Wrong station behavior, maybe? The Hessan blinked. This was not aggression. That was what made it effective. Aggression he knew. Most people on Kestral used aggression the way weak welders use excess sealant. Too much of it, badly placed, hoping it would compensate for structural uncertainty. Vane was simply being exact. The Hessan tried repetition, which on Kestral often stood in for authority. Private storage. Yes. I'm not disputing the room's feelings. I need the conduit behind the north panel. The Hessan stared at him for a long second, as if waiting for the moment the conversation became more normal. It did not. I watched Vane's face. Still calm. Still tired. Still built entirely around the job. No interest in the room, the cargo, the hidden economy. Only the access point. That, more than anything, was what made the exchange unstable. The criminal ecosystem on Kestral was built on fear, greed, silence, and selective curiosity. Elias Vane was interacting with it from outside all four categories. The Hessan finally said, come back tomorrow? Will the conduit be less inside the room tomorrow? The Hessan shut the door. Pell exhaled the way one exhales after seeing a small child address a live industrial cutter with sincere questions. Well, he said. Vane looked at the closed door. Then at the schematic. Then at the wall section to the left of the door, following the conduit path in his mind. Alternative route exists, he said. Pell leaned over the tablet. It does. It exists in the sense that someone with enough cable, enough time and inadequate self-respect could route around the blockage through the outer service belt. Pell read the line trace. That adds almost 300 meters. Yes. And drops delivery efficiency. Yes. And takes us through Deck 5 outer transit. Yes. Pell was quiet. Then carefully, that corridor is also used by the black spline. Vane nodded once as if the station had just become a more annoying equation. I see. He said it without drama, which made me deeply suspicious he was not actually discouraged. That suspicion proved justified. By second shift he had requisitioned the extra cable. By evening he had updated the work log. By next morning he was in the outer service corridor on Deck 5 with a relay spool, a field kit, Pell, and the kind of concentration that generally precedes either brilliance or an official apology. The outer service corridor ran along the skin of the station between environmental shell plating and the secondary freight skeleton. It was cold enough to bite exposed hands and lit only by maintenance strips every 15 meters, half of which had developed a soft asynchronous flicker that made moving crates look faintly haunted. It was also, as Pell had warned, not actually in used. When Vane rounded the second bend with the cable over one shoulder, he found 6 black spline loaders midway through shifting sealed containers along grav sleds. Their escort stood with them. Bro. There are circumstances in which size becomes a social tool even before violence enters the room. Brome was one of those circumstances. He looked at the cable. Then at Vane. Then at Pell. Unavailable corridor, he said. The phrase had the quality of something repeated often enough to become muscle memory. Vane set the cable spool down carefully so it would not uncoil. I noticed that detail because it mattered. Even now, even here, he was still protecting the work first. I'm routing a bypass line, he said. Engineering authority. He showed the access badge. Brome did not look at it. This corridor is unavailable. There was a pause then in which the station could have chosen a simpler future. Vane looked at the crates. Not long. Not greedily. Just long enough. No manifest markers. No public destination tags. Power-dampened grav sleds. Timing scheduled against low-traffic shift change. He looked back at Brome. Those aren't declared shipments, he said. Every living thing in the corridor became still. I do not mean metaphorically. Even the loaders froze with their hands still on the sled bars. Pell stopped breathing so completely I became briefly concerned for him. Vane, realizing what he had just done to the air, raised one hand slightly. That is not a problem for me, he said at once. I am not a regulator. I do not care what is in the crates. I care about the conduit load path behind this wall and the fact that your station's secondary grid is one bad surge away from turning 3 decks into a lesson. Brome remained expressionless. Which, from him, was an active condition. Vane continued in the same tone he might have used to discuss gasket wear. I can run the bypass here along the far wall. It takes 2 hours. It does not interfere with your cargo movement. I leave. We never have this conversation again. That, I thought, was a very human kind of practicality. Not naive. Not brave in the stupid sense. Simply interested in keeping categories separate. Brome looked at the line path on the tablet. Then at the crates. Then at the dark end of the corridor where, beyond sight, the route bent toward the private warehouse belt. Finally he said, You talk to Sarek. I would strongly prefer not to. Not relevant. That got the smallest reaction from Vane all day. His eyes went up for half a second toward the ceiling, as if checking whether the universe wished to explain itself before he continued. It did not. He lifted the cable again. Lead on then. That was how the station's 2 nervous systems finally touched directly. Not in a bar brawl. Not in a threatened extortion scene. An engineer trying to route a legal bypass line because the wrong room sat on top of the wrong conduit in the wrong station at exactly the right time. The black spline's visible office sat behind a commercial front on deck 4, above a bar called the Shatterglass Room, which had been decorated by someone with a deep personal commitment to intimidation and no measurable relationship with aesthetic restraint. Trophy cases. Harsh side lighting. Deliberately uncomfortable visitor seating. A desk large enough to imply power and small enough to prove the power still needed props. Sarek Dahl was waiting when they entered. He did not stand. He did not need to. He had the sort of stillness people spend years learning because they know motion wastes authority if chosen poorly. Vane looked around once, took in the room, then sat without being told. That, more than the directness with Brome, was what made me understand the trouble was now unavoidable. He did not perform submission because submission was not relevant to the task. Sarek watched him with the patient, cool attention of someone studying a tool that may prove useful, dangerous, or both. You are the engineer, he said. Yes. You are causing corridor complications. I'm trying not to. Sarek tilted his head very slightly. This answer, I think, was not one he encountered often. Vane set the tablet on his knee. I filed the station requests properly, he said. The office lost them, mishandled them, or fed them to some administrative fungus. I attempted the direct access point, was told to return later, calculated an alternate route, and discovered the alternate route also overlaps with your activities. My goal remains unchanged. Stabilize the auxiliary grid before it takes the station down in sections. Sarek listened without interruption. This was his own kind of intelligence. Men like Brome are obvious. Men like Sarek are ecosystems. When Vane finished, Sarek asked, You are not curious what my activities are? And there it was. The usual pressure point. Interest. Fear. Leverage. The invitation to show one's category. Vane thought for perhaps 1 second. I'm curious about many things, he said. I'm selective about which curiosities improve a job. Silence. Then, for the first time since the conversation began, something in Sarek's expression changed. Not warmth. Certainly not. More like the precise recalibration of a person realizing the other side is not refusing the game out of fear, but because he is engaged in another game entirely and considers this one side noise. What do you need? Sarek asked. 20 minutes in Annex 12, Vane said. Or permission to route the bypass through Deck 5 without the corridor becoming socially educational. I nearly laughed and had to disguise it as a cough. Sarek leaned back slightly. You speak very plainly. I'm tired, Vane said. And your station is one bad load spike away from emergency dark. The word "you're" hung in the room for a moment. Not accusatory. Structural. Sarek noticed that too. In that instant I think he understood more about Elias Vane than anyone else on Kestral yet had. The human was not trying to challenge him. He was including him inside the consequences. That is much more difficult to ignore. 20 minutes, Sarek said at last. Annex 12. Brome goes with you. Appreciated. Vane stood. No victory posture. No relief. Just adjustment to a solved access problem. As he turned toward the door, Sarek said, Engineer. Vane looked back. If I find you interested in my business after all. Vane nodded once. You won't. And the strange thing was, I believed him completely. So I think did Sarek. That belief would become important later. Because from that moment on, the station's hidden structure had let the engineer inside it just long enough to assume the engineer still intended to remain only an engineer. That was its mistake. The station did not change all at once after Sarek Dahl gave Elias Vane 20 minutes in Annex 12. Broken places never do. They change in tiny ways first. In permissions. In glances. In which doors open after one knock instead of two. In who starts asking questions with genuine curiosity instead of defensive habit. Kestral remained Kestral, flickering, patched, chemically fragrant in all the wrong ways, but something in its internal weather had shifted. The engineer was no longer just a contractor crawling through panels with too much caffeine and an unhealthy relationship to failing infrastructure. He had become legible to the station's second nervous system. That was dangerous. And at the time I still assumed the danger ran primarily toward him. I was wrong. The real turning point began with a trader named Nerol Quist. I knew Nerol before any of this because auditors, merchants, and low-margin transport specialists all end up sharing the same tired air in the same bonded bays often enough to acquire opinions about one another's habits. Nerol was an Oshani route hauler, small-framed, sharp-eyed, with the species' characteristic side-set third eye that made it feel, in conversation, as though you were being assessed for two different categories of honesty at once. He ran a modest cargo loop through the interior minor lanes and made what I would describe as an honorable living by the standards of freight economics, which is to say he lied on tone more often than substance and paid his docking fees before anyone had to threaten him. He also had an arrangement with the black spline. That was not unusual. Kestral was full of arrangements. The station breathed them. If you wanted priority berth access, there was an arrangement. If you wanted bonded goods moved without waiting behind 6 days of refrigeration cargo, there was an arrangement. If you wanted your shipment left uninspected in a warehouse district where inspections developed expensive appetites, there was an arrangement. The black spline did not invent dependency on Kestral. It simply learned how to price it. Nerol's arrangement had begun, from what I later pieced together, as most such arrangements begin, with limited options, soft coercion, and a price low enough to look survivable if you avoided staring at the structure too hard. The spline used his route for freight movements that could not comfortably exist on the official side of station paperwork. He moved the cargo, took the payment, kept his head down, and survived another quarter. Then Sarek adjusted the rate. Reduced Nerol's take by almost half. Made the arrangement permanent. Added, through Brome, the kind of language that is never technically a threat because technicality is a species-wide addiction among predators who prefer their violence pre-laundered. Nerol had 46 hours to agree before the matter would become less flexible. That phrase reached me secondhand through cargo gossip first, then directly 2 hours later when I found Nerol sitting outside his berth on Dock 7 turning an empty manifest slate over and over in his hands with the distracted precision of a man trying not to imagine what Brome looked like in his doorway. He looked up when my shadow crossed the floor plating. Ivan, he said. I sat beside him on the cargo crate without asking permission. This is something one can do with traders one has known long enough to dislike only in manageable quantities. You look terrible, I said. He gave me a humorless half-smile. That is encouraging. I was worried the fear made me look healthier. I waited. He told me everything. Not dramatically. Not in the style of people seeking rescue from a hero-shaped narrative. More the way practical creatures describe structural failure once they realize pretending surprise will not help. The cut rate. The new terms. The deadline. Brome's visit. The fact that station security had become ceremonial years ago. The fact that Horrelden would, at best, schedule concern about it after 3 committee exchanges and 1-night cycle. The fact that the trade compact would process a coercion dispute on approximately the same timeline glaciers used to negotiate with coastlines. When he finished, he looked down at the slate again. I know how this sounds, he said. It sounds like Kestral. No, he said. It sounds like I stayed too long and got folded into the furniture. That, I think, was the line that made me angry. Not because it was poetic. Narrow was not generally poetic unless sleep-deprived. Because it was accurate. Stations like Kestral break people partly by converting outrage into scheduling. You stop asking whether the thing is acceptable and start asking what version of it you can survive without losing route access, berth privileges, contract continuity, or your face. That is how ecosystems of soft coercion sustain themselves. They make endurance look like maturity. I thought very briefly about taking the matter to Horrelden. Then I remembered Horrelden. I thought about trade compact escalation. Then I remembered timelines. I thought about doing nothing. Then I remembered Elias Vane. That was not because I thought of him as a savior. It was because by day 11 of his stay, he had become the nearest thing on Kestral to a person who still reacted to broken structures as if repair remained a morally reasonable category. So I did something I still classify for official purposes as adjacent intervention rather than direct interference. I took Nerl to Deck 6. The engineering bay was bright by Kestral standards, which meant you could see your own impending exhaustion in reasonably accurate color. Vane had turned one full section of the bay into an active relay surgery field. Junction casings were stacked by subsystem. 2 lower deck panels lay open. A live schematic wall pulsed across the far bulkhead in enough layered diagnostics to convince any sensible bystander that the human had either achieved mastery or developed a very refined obsession. He was halfway inside a relay trunk when we arrived. Pell sat nearby on a crate, officially cataloging parts, unofficially monitoring what I had come to think of as the Vane event horizon. Nerl stopped 3 paces inside the bay as if reconsidering the wisdom of his own body. I should leave, he said quietly. You came all the way here, I replied. At least commit to the mistake. That earned the smallest possible reaction from Pell, which on him counted as open laughter. Vane's voice came from inside the trunk. If that's an auditor, a tech, and one person breathing like bad news, I'm busy but not unavailable. He backed out, wiped one hand on a cloth that had long since surrendered its original color, and took in the scene in a single glance. Not our faces separately. The geometry. Me standing but not agitated. Pell alert but unsurprised. Nerl on the edge of flight, carrying none of the body language of a client, supplier, or inspector. Vane pointed once at a tool case. Sit, he said to Nerl. Nerl obeyed instantly. That was, in itself, revealing. People trust competence before they trust kindness. Competence sounds like instructions that might lead somewhere stable. Vane capped his diagnostic stylus and leaned against the work table. What kind of problem? He asked. Not what happened. Not are you all right? What kind? System classification first. It was the most engineer thing I had ever heard in a human voice. Nerl hesitated. I'm not sure this is your kind of problem. Vane considered him for half a second. Then classify it badly and I'll correct you. Pell actually laughed that time. Nerl, to his credit, told the whole story cleanly once he began. The freight arrangement. The cut. The permanent terms. The deadline. Brome's role in communicating what Kestral liked to call incentives. Vane listened without interruption, which with him did not feel passive. It felt like measurement. When Nerl finished, Vane asked the only question that mattered first. What outcome do you want? Nerl blinked. I have learned that people trapped in coercive systems often find this question harder than outsiders expect. Survival creates adaptive imagination. It narrows desire into manageable increments. Most victims of long pressure do not ask for justice first. They ask for the version of injustice least likely to worsen tomorrow. I want him to leave it alone, Nerl said at last. Sarek. Yes. Specific outcome, Vane said, nodding once. Good. He reached for his tablet, not because the conversation was over, but because now it had entered his native language. Constraints. When is the deadline? 46 hours. Less now. Has there been physical violence? Not yet. Do they need your route specifically? Nerl thought. Not uniquely. But it's efficient. Efficient how? I watched the shift happen in Vane's face then. Not emotional hardening. Pattern assembly. This was the part most people miss when they imagine competence. They think the impressive part is the answer. It isn't. The impressive part is the speed at which some minds stop hearing a story and start seeing the infrastructure behind it. Nerl, still caught in his own pressure, did not notice it. Pell did. So did I. Vane went still in the way he did only when the station was beginning to line up internally. What decks? He asked. Nerl frowned. What? Which decks do you use for transfer staging? Which storage sectors? What time windows? How often do they route through bonded or semi-bonded channels? How often through service corridors? Does Sarek use fixed warehouse space or rotating access? Do the same people always meet you? Nerl stared at him. Pell looked at me and mouthed, there it is. I knew what he meant. The face. The one Pell had once described as the look Vane got when a problem technically outside scope drifted close enough to overlap with something he was already repairing. Nerl answered the question slowly at first, then faster as Vane's follow-ups made it clear this was not random curiosity. Deck 4 transfers. Warehouse annexes 7 and 9. Service corridor reroutes when scan traffic was high. Repeating timing windows. Recurring power-dampened grav sleds. The same 2 handling teams plus Brome whenever pressure needed embodiment. Vane wrote almost nothing down. He did not need to. By the time Nerl finished, the station had already begun redrawing itself behind his eyes. There was a pause. Pell, with the caution of a man who had become very familiar with how dangerous silence could be around engineering questions, said, "You're doing the thing." Vane did not look up from the tablet. "What thing?" "The thing where you stop blinking and the problem gets larger." "I haven't stopped blinking." "Metaphorically. That's lazy language, Pell." "You are proving my point." Nerl looked from one to the other. "Should I be worried?" Vane finally looked up. "Yes," he said. "But not in the direction you think." Nerl went very still. I said, "That is an unhelpful sentence." "It's an accurate sentence." He set the tablet down. The station's auxiliary grid interfaces with commercial load balancing, environmental control redundancy, and corridor power signatures. Which means my contract gives me legitimate access to the systems that determine how this place actually behaves after dark. Nerl stared at him. Pell closed his eyes briefly, as if the words had entered a category he had been hoping the universe would avoid. I knew at that moment that the situation had crossed from personal coercion into systems territory. Which meant Elias Vane had stopped being merely sympathetic. He had become interested. That is much worse for the people on the wrong side of a broken structure. Nerl swallowed. "What are you going to do?" Vane considered that with irritating honesty. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know the kind of thing." Nerl was silent. Then, very quietly, "I came here because I thought maybe you would tell me whether I should just accept the rate." Vane looked at him for a long second. "No," he said. "Not dramatic. Not warm. Certain." Nerl lowered his eyes. Some small portion of the tension in his shoulders left the room before he did. That was when I understood the real function of this phase in the story, though of course I did not call it a phase then. The station had given Vane a technical problem. Now it had given him a moral one. And because he was exactly the kind of person he was about to solve them with the same tools. There is a version of human danger that most species recognize immediately. It is loud. It makes direct eye contact at the wrong time, climbs onto unstable furniture, says something morally uncomplicated, and then creates a physical problem for everyone within 10 meters. That version exists. I have seen recordings. Kestral Junction, however, encountered the other version. The quieter one. The one that drinks too much stimulant concentrate, reads contracts properly, and starts building consequences out of infrastructure. Once Narrowquist left the engineering bay, Elias Vane did not become dramatic. He did not pace. He did not make declarations. He did not even swear, which frankly would have made Pell feel better because swearing at least suggests the problem remains emotional and therefore possibly containable. Instead he picked up his tablet and said, "I need the full power architecture for decks 3 through 6, including legacy overlays if they exist." Pell looked at him the way some people look at incoming weather that has already made up its mind. "They barely exist." "Then I need the inaccurate version, the outdated version, and the one everyone knows is wrong but still uses because replacing it would require admitting things." Pell blinked twice. "That last one is not a formal document category." "It should be," Vane said. And that was how it started. He did not ask for weapons. He did not ask for allies. He asked for schematics. For the next 6 hours, the engineering bay looked less like a repair space and more like the interior of a mind in the middle of becoming dangerous. Old station diagrams across one table. Live load data on the wall. Maintenance logs cross-referenced with commercial draw patterns. Corridor lighting feeds. Environmental regulation charts. Emergency backup distribution trees. Contract language. Access permissions. Pell and I spent most of that period fetching materials and trying with varying degrees of success to keep up. I continued telling myself I was only present in an observational capacity. This was, even by my standards, an optimistic interpretation. At one point I asked, "What exactly are you looking for?" Vane did not answer immediately. He was staring at a station power map so old it still labeled the lower warehouse belt as civic storage instead of bonded commercial overflow, which was administrative shorthand for we stopped tracking what those rooms really are years ago and no one got promoted by noticing. Finally he said, "Truth." I waited. He tapped the map. Every system tells the truth eventually. Not in reports. Reports are social. Power signatures aren't. Load behavior isn't. Ventilation timing isn't. Transit corridor lighting changes don't care what story the station tells itself. He moved 3 windows on the display into alignment. One showed power consumption on deck 4 commercial zones. One showed corridor lighting load along the outer transit belt. One showed environmental compensation spikes near the lower storage annexes. Individually they meant nothing to me. Together, I felt something cold and precise begin forming. "You can see them," I said. "Yes." That single word carried more satisfaction than any speech. Because he could. The black spline had spent years building itself into Kestral's blind spots. Mislabeled freight, quiet corridor movement, undeclared warehouse occupation, coercive local control, all softened by the fact that nothing on the station was healthy enough for one more irregularity to stand out. They thought the station's brokenness concealed them. Elias Vane looked at the same brokenness and saw data. That is the exact point where a corrupt ecosystem becomes vulnerable to the wrong kind of engineer. He began with monitors. That was what made the whole thing so elegant. Not sabotage. Not theft. Not exposure through dramatic testimony. Monitoring relays. Ordinary, contract legal, technically justified monitoring relays. He installed the first on Deck 3 in the commercial load balancing node, under the very reasonable explanation that the auxiliary repair program required comparative efficiency tracking across all linked commercial sectors. This was true. It was also incomplete, which is not the same as false. The node itself was a compact relay cluster behind a maintenance panel near the Market Ring's western power bus. It smelled faintly of dust, heat, and old compromise. Vane opened it, checked 3 lines, made 2 notes, then mounted a small passive relay module beside the regulation bus. Pell, holding the tool tray, whispered, "What exactly does that do?" "Records load signatures." "For efficiency?" "Yes." He did not look up. Pell frowned. That sounded like the kind of yes that means the question was too small. Vane tightened the housing plate. "It records what draws power, when it draws power, in what pattern, and how those patterns interact with linked systems." That sounds bigger than efficiency. It is bigger than efficiency. He sealed the node. Which is why I said yes. That was the experience of working near him for any length of time. Every answer was complete if you were willing to survive inside its implications. The second relay went into the Deck 4 transit corridor lighting controls. The third went into the Deck 5 outer service line, the same corridor where Brome had stopped the bypass run. The fourth went into a buffer distribution cluster tied to warehouse climate control, a wonderfully dull category of infrastructure that, like all wonderfully dull categories, turned out to contain the real architecture of power if inspected with sufficient disrespect for appearances. Each relay was fully documented, legally installed, within contract scope, technically defensible, impossible to challenge without first admitting the station's official power maps no longer reflected its real operations. That last part was genius. He was not merely gathering data. He was choosing a path in which every attempt to stop him would expose the very thing the station had spent years not naming. By late second shift, Pell finally said the quiet part aloud. "You're mapping them." Vane sat back on his heels beneath the Deck 5 line access hatch and regarded him briefly. "I'm mapping the station." Pell crossed his arms. "Those are not the same thing." "No," Vane said. "They stopped being different a while ago. I wrote that line down later. Not because I intended to use it in any report. Because it was the truest thing anybody had said about Kestral in years. That was the underlying problem, you see. The black spline had not merely exploited the station. They had grown into its neglected structure so thoroughly that separating infrastructure from coercion had become almost impossible. Fixing one without touching the other was like trying to repair a relay while insisting the burn pattern remain exactly as it was. Neryl's problem was personal. The mechanism behind it was systemic. Vane, being exactly himself, refused to treat those as separate categories. Around hour 9 I found him reading his own contract. Again. He had already read it, by Pell's estimate, 12 times. This did not seem to him excessive. He stood in front of the wall display, cup in one hand, contract slate in the other, and said almost to himself, "The station office is criminally bad at limitation language." Pell looked up from inventory coding. "That sounds useful." "It's catastrophic," Vane said, which in his vocabulary was usually a positive sign. He handed me the slate. I read the highlighted section twice. Infrastructure Systems Restoration Authority, temporary contractor status. Access privileges include all linked power, environmental and safety management architecture reasonably required to diagnose, stabilize and document station-wide distribution failures. I looked up. That is broad. It is beautifully broad. Pell said, "You sound happy." "I'm not happy," Vane said. "I'm respected by a badly written document." Then he took the slate back and returned to the diagrams. What followed over the next 12 hours was one of the most satisfying demonstrations of systems thinking I have ever witnessed. He did not plan revenge. He built a clean technical path from observed truth to correct authority. That distinction matters. First, he tagged every monitor to produce time-stamped load signatures. Second, he cross-indexed those signatures against official commercial declarations, berth movement schedules, and station transit lighting patterns. Third, he isolated recurring mismatches. Power-dampened cargo movement through supposedly low-use corridors. Refrigeration draw where no declared cold storage existed. Repeated transit activity in warehouse sectors listed as inactive. Environmental support loads tied to spaces officially logged as empty. Route timing that intersected exactly with Neryl's freight windows and black spline staging periods. Then he did the most dangerous thing of all. He documented it cleanly. People underestimate paperwork because they confuse boredom with weakness. Corrupt systems do not fear accusations nearly as much as they fear clear records. A messy complaint can be ignored. A clean technical report with timestamps, methodology, chain of custody, and legally gathered data becomes much harder to kill without leaving fingerprints. By the time Kestral reached third shift, Elias Vane had built precisely that. I know because I watched him do it. He wrote the report the same way he repaired machinery. No theatrics. No rhetorical inflation. No moral posing. Just evidence arranged in the order reality required. At one point he asked Pell, "What is the official title of Dorvak's office?" Pell looked confused. "Trade Compact Station Representative." "Good. That sounds like someone who wants appendices." Pell said, "You are enjoying this." Vane took a drink. "I am enjoying accuracy." Which was true and not the whole truth. The real beauty of the plan emerged when Pell finally understood the timing. The monitors were passive. The data was real-time. The report would be complete by the next cycle. Dorvak, the famously exhausted compact representative, had exactly the kind of jurisdiction nobody respected until it became suddenly ruinous. And Vane had built the path so that once the report landed on the right desk, the next steps would not depend on station courage. They would depend on treaty obligation. That is how you dismantle a local coercion structure properly. Not by hoping better people show up. By forcing the existing system to act through its own rules. Pell realized it first and sat down very slowly on an empty crate. "You're not reporting them," he said. Vane glanced over. "I am reporting the station." "That's worse." "Yes." Pell looked at the wall display, then at the relay list, then at the contract scope language, then back at Vane. "In how much trouble are they?" Vane thought about it. "In a fair amount." That answer, like all his answers, was both restrained and viciously accurate. Because he had done something remarkable. He had taken a failing grid, a broad maintenance contract, a neglected station, a tired regulator, one coerced merchant, and a criminal organization hidden in plain sight, and turned them into one continuous technical problem with one lawful technical solution. By dawn the report existed. Neryl had not been touched. Sarek did not yet know what was coming. Dorvak had not yet seen the file. And the station, still flickering and smelling faintly of burnt insulation and old chemical sealant, had no idea that its own power system had just become the instrument of its partial moral correction. The report went to Dorvac 12 hours before Narrowquist's deadline. That timing was not dramatic. That is exactly why it was so effective. Drama invites countermeasures. Drama tells people something important is happening and gives them permission to become theatrical in response. Elias Vane understood this instinctively. He never moved at the speed of outrage if he could move at the speed of inevitability instead. Dorvac's office sat on deck 2 between an underfunded customs archive and a disused mediation room that had not hosted an actual mediation in 3 years because no one on Kestral believed disputes improved when paperwork entered them unless the paperwork came attached to enforcement. The office itself was small, overheated, and built around the kind of institutional furniture designed by species who thought discomfort improved seriousness. Dorvac, trade compact representative for Kestral Junction, had the exhausted face of a man who had once been ambitious enough to annoy the wrong people and had since been posted somewhere the bureaucracy expected him to fade politely. He had not faded. He had merely become slower in visible ways and quieter in dangerous ones. I know this now. At the time I thought he was half retired while still drawing salary. Vane knew better after one conversation. He came out of the office just after second shift meal cycle with the empty expression of a man who had just confirmed an important machine still turned on beneath a layer of dust. Well? I asked. He adjusted the tablet under one arm. He woke up. That was all he said at first. Only later did Pell tell me what had happened inside. Vane had entered, introduced himself, placed the technical packet on the desk, and said with complete professional calm that in the course of station-wide infrastructure restoration he had observed a set of power use anomalies likely relevant to trade compact enforcement obligations under undeclared commercial operations, coercive routing interference, and manifest inconsistency statutes. Dorvac, who by Pell's account had looked only half alive at the beginning of that sentence, reached full consciousness by the end of the words enforcement obligations. He reviewed the summary pages in silence. Then the appendices. Then the monitoring methodology. Then the corridor heat maps. Then the chain of custody logs. At one point he asked, "Did anyone tell you to compile this?" And Vane, being exactly himself, answered, "No. The station did." That is not the sort of line one forgets easily. Dorvac spent 93 minutes reviewing the report. Then he filed a priority intervention request to Regional Compact Enforcement with full evidentiary support, verified timestamps, corridor overlays, probable undisclosed commercial control maps, and a flag indicating active coercive leverage against at least one independent merchant operator. It was the strongest filing he had submitted in 4 years. Which, as it turned out, had been exactly the problem. The Black Splines Information Web noticed the filing 8 hours later. This is important. Because a lot of weaker stories would have allowed the trap to spring invisibly. This one works because the antagonist is smart enough to realize something is wrong before the official consequences fully arrive. That is what gives the confrontation weight. Sarek Dahl did not react publicly. He did not send Brome to drag Narrow out of his berth immediately. He did not rage through the market ring. He did not summon half the spline into motion just to prove motion remained possible. He investigated. That was why he was dangerous in the first place. By the time Kestral night cycle rolled into second shift, he had already done what any serious operator would do. Checked movement logs, reviewed visitor records, traced recent maintenance authorizations, and noticed that one name appeared far too often in places where clean systems had recently become interested in dirty ones. Elias Vane. The engineer. The man who had asked for 20 minutes in a storage room, said he did not care about criminal business, and then filed the most structurally dangerous report on the station in years. If Sarek had misunderstood that sequence emotionally, Vane might have been in real danger. But Sarek did not misunderstand people emotionally. He went to deck 6 alone. That was the moment the balance shifted. Because a man like Sarek does not visit an engineering bay personally unless he has decided this is no longer a matter for intimidation by subordinates. Either the engineer was more than he appeared, or the engineer had become expensive enough to deserve direct evaluation. I was present. Not because I planned to be. Because by then Kestral had begun pulling everyone with functioning curiosity toward Elias Vane's orbit, and I had made the practical error of admitting to myself that this was more important than my filter palettes. Vane was inside a panel when Sarek entered. Pell saw him first and froze in the very specific way station workers freeze when two kinds of authority they never expected to overlap suddenly occupy the same room. Vane, hearing nothing because the relay housing was open and a test pulse was cycling through the lower branch, said from inside the panel, "Hold that coupling steady or the reading's useless." Pell continued holding the coupling with the courage of a man who had lost control of the scene 3 minutes before understanding it. Sarek waited. No demand. No announcement. No dramatic opening. That, more than anything, made the moment feel dangerous. Finally Vane backed out, checked the tablet, nodded once to himself and only then looked up. He saw Sarek. Saw the absence of Brome. Saw that this was a conversation, not an abduction. And said calmly, I need 90 seconds to close this panel properly. Sarek stared at him. Then said, take them. I have replayed that exchange in my head many times. Because it tells you everything about both men. Sarek could not afford to look reactive. Vane could not afford to leave the work unfinished. So the station held still while one closed a panel and the other watched him do it. Exactly 82 seconds later, Vane stood, wiped his hands once on a cloth and faced him. You filed data with compact enforcement, Sarek said. I filed a technical report. About my operations. About station power usage patterns inconsistent with declared commercial activity. Sarek held his gaze. You understand what you've done? Yes. And yet you are still here. I'm under contract for 19 more days, Vane said. I'm not, by temperament, a theatrical person. But I admit that in this moment I almost laughed out loud from the sheer structural perfection of the answer. Sarek did not laugh. He was trying to understand the human. That was visible now. Not in any softness, but in the way his stillness had sharpened into study. You told me, he said, that your only concern was the grid. Vane nodded. That was true. You involved yourself anyway. Yes. Why? And there it was, the real question. Not procedural. Not criminal. Not territorial. Moral. Why had a man with one bag too much caffeine, and a station repair contract inserted himself into a coercive structure that did not technically belong to him? Vane answered without preparing the room for it. Because someone was being leaned on, he said. And I had a way to stop it without breaking anything. No speech. No righteousness. Just a statement of operating logic. Sarek's expression changed almost imperceptibly. You have created a much larger problem than the one you claim to care about. Yes, Vane said. That part is unfortunate. Pell made the tiniest sound behind a relay crate and then immediately regretted existing audibly. Sarek took one slow step closer. Do you know what happens, he asked, to people who make large problems for me on Kestral? Vane thought about that. Not performatively. Actually, I imagined something unpleasant and strategically expressive. The answer was so dry, so direct, that for one dangerous second the room stopped belonging to any recognizable social script. Then Sarek said, and you are not afraid. This was not accusation. It was diagnosis. Vane met his eyes. I'm appropriately concerned, he said. You're in my workspace, you're unhappy, and Kestral has a long record of solving discomfort with bad judgment. Those are real variables. But fear would make me less accurate, and I don't think accuracy is the thing to lose right now. That sentence changed the room. Because until then, Sarek had still been testing categories. Full. Idealist. Amateur meddler. Bureaucratic opportunist. Someone with hidden backing. Now he was confronting something worse. A competent person who had already accepted the danger, measured it, and chosen clarity anyway. That kind of person is extremely difficult to move using standard methods. Sarek asked the only useful question left. What do you want from me? Vane answered immediately. Leave Narrow Quist alone. Not bring down the Syndicate. Not surrender operations. Not confess. Not bargain. One specific outcome. One fix. Again, this was what made him so effective. He never widened his moral demand just because the tools in his hand happened to touch a larger system. He stayed exact. Sarek's voice went colder. In exchange for what? Nothing. That landed harder than a threat would have. Because trade was Sarek's native language. Incentive, leverage, reciprocity, implied exchange. A man asking for something without offering payment, without bluffing force, and without claiming moral superiority was speaking outside the expected system. I am not negotiating, Vane said. The filing exists. The intervention is already in motion. I can't reverse it and wouldn't. But the specific problem I cared about was narrow. So I'm asking directly. Sarek studied him for a long time. Then he said very softly, you have nothing to compel me. Vane nodded once. That's true. The silence after that was almost unbearable. Then Vane added, but you came here alone. Something in Sarek's face tightened. Not much. Enough. Vane continued, still calm. If your objective was intimidation, you'd have brought Brome or 3 witnesses or both. If your objective was immediate harm, I wouldn't still be standing next to my own tools. You came here because you wanted to understand what happened before deciding how to answer it. You let that sit. That tells me two useful things. First, that you prefer control to noise. Second, that hurting Nerl now doesn't improve your position. The filing is in motion either way. If you touch him, you add a cleaner, more personal violation to a file that is already bad for you. It doesn't help. It just satisfies emotion. And I don't think you run this station on emotion. I have spent nearly 2 decades watching people try to survive criminals through flattery, fear, concealment, or pleading. I had never seen anyone survive by handing the criminal a clean description of himself and trusting the criminal to recognize the efficiency in it. Sarek looked at Vane. Then at the work tables. Then at the open schematics, the stacked parts, the categorized failure trays, the monitors, the contract slate lying face down beside the stimulant container. He was, I think, seeing the full shape for the first time. This human had arrived 10 days earlier with 1 bag and a station job. In 10 days he had understood the infrastructure better than management, found the overlap between power and criminal movement, documented the station's hidden nervous system, filed data strong enough to wake Dorvac, and still, even now, cared about one merchant more than symbolic victory. That is not how most trouble behaves. Most trouble wants to be noticed. Vane wanted the correct result. Sarek finally said, "Narrow Quist is not touched." Vane nodded once. "Thank you." Not triumph. Not relief. Just acknowledgement of a solved variable. Then Sarek said, "This does not make us even." And Vane replied with one of the cleanest lines I have ever heard on Kestral Junction. "I didn't ask for even. I asked for that." Sarek left. No threats. No promises. Just departure. The moment he cleared the doorway, Pell set the relay coupling down on the nearest flat surface with the reverence of a man returning a dangerous relic to neutral ground. His hands were shaking. "So," he said after a full 10 seconds, "I would like to register that the last 8 minutes were professionally upsetting." Vane picked up the coupling, checked the contacts, and handed it back. "We still need the lower bypass seated before shift change." Pell stared at him. "Did you hear anything I heard?" "Yes." "And your response is to finish the panel?" Vane looked honestly confused. "It's still broken." That was Elias Vane in perfect form. The confrontation had happened. The system had shifted. The danger had passed or at least changed shape. And in his hierarchy of reality, the panel remained where truth still lived. He climbed back into the access housing. Pell looked at me. I looked at Pell. Neither of us had anything useful left to say. Because the victory had already happened. Not officially. Not on paper. But where it mattered. Sarek had understood the equation. Nerl would not be touched. The report was already in motion. And the station had just learned that one quiet engineer with legal access, correct documentation, and a sufficiently accurate view of human incentives could do more damage to corruption than 3 angry speeches and a small riot. The enforcement team arrived 5 days early. That alone told me how strong Elias Vane's report had been. Compact intervention units do not move quickly for ordinary corruption. They move quickly for 2 things. Politically embarrassing corruption and corruption documented so cleanly that delay becomes evidence of institutional cowardice. Kestral, through a combination of long neglect and very bad luck, had somehow achieved both. There were 6 of them. They came off a gray enforcement cutter with sealed casework, portable audit rigs, legal authority from 42 signatory governments, and the particular demeanor of professionals who had spent long enough in ugly places to stop mistaking procedural calm for softness. They did not arrive shouting. They did not make a show of force in the docking ring. They went directly to Dorvac's office, woke half the station administration by existing near it, and began building the kind of paper wall through which only the very stupid or very desperate attempt to run. Kestral, being Kestral, contained no shortage of both. But not enough. The first warehouse seal went up before second shift meal cycle. By evening, 3 undeclared freight paths through the lower storage annexes had been suspended pending review. 2 side route access chains were frozen. The corridor movement logs Vane had reconstructed from power signatures aligned so perfectly with the enforcement team's own access scans that even the station office, which had spent years professionally misunderstanding its own structure, could no longer pretend the discrepancies were merely administrative weather. Narrow Quist was not named in the first wave. That, I knew, mattered more than anything else. I found him on Dock 7 standing beside his berth with all 3 eyes fixed on the enforcement marker sealed across a transit lane he had spent 2 years being careful not to notice too directly. "Well?" I asked. He let out a breath so slowly it seemed older than he was. "They haven't touched my records." They won't. He looked at me sideways. You sound very sure. I have observed Elias Vane at work for 3 weeks, I said. At this point certainty is simply the most accurate available posture. That got the smallest laugh out of him. It also got him breathing like a living being again instead of a freight operator suspended above financial ruin. The black spline did not collapse in a day. This is important. Corrupt systems that have grown into infrastructure rarely collapse theatrically. They fray. They lose access. They lose timing. They lose confidence in which corridor still belongs to them and which door now opens onto a legal disaster. They start discovering that fear has a maintenance cost, and that cost rises sharply once someone competent has mapped the system properly. Sarek Dahl disappeared from public circulation for 31 hours after the intervention team arrived. Brome was seen twice, both times without his usual certainty. One of the 3 bars associated with black spline operations closed for ventilation inspection, which was both technically true and spiritually hilarious. By the end of the second day, Dorvac had filed 7 separate compact violations. 7. The same Dorvac who, for 4 years, had looked like a man only marginally committed to remaining awake. It turns out frustration ages very differently once given proper data. I passed his office that evening and saw him standing over 3 stacked displays, eyes bright in a way that should have worried half the station more than it apparently did. His assistant, a young Velhari named Sorath who had previously treated government work as a form of carefully managed disappointment, looked almost gleeful. He built the whole thing for us, she whispered as I passed. I did not ask who he was. There was no need. Elias Vane meanwhile kept working. That remained the most disorienting part of the whole affair. He had not arrived to become Kestral's corrective legend. He had arrived to fix the auxiliary systems. The black spline investigation, the intervention filing, the saving of Narrow Quist, the structural humiliation of local corruption by means of contract scope and load signatures. These had all happened, in his view, adjacent to the actual job. So he continued the actual job. Deck 3's unstable junction cluster came offline and back cleaner. The market ring flicker stopped on day 17. Deck 7's gravity drift normalized on day 19, which caused a spontaneous celebration involving dropped utensils, improperly secured tool kits, and one elderly merchant who threw a handful of dried fruit into the air just to watch it fall straight down for the first time in months. The air changed too. Not metaphorically. Literally. With the auxiliary environmental regulation banks finally recalibrated, Kestral stopped smelling like scorched compromise and started smelling merely like sealant, traffic, food court grease, and slightly overworked ventilation. Which, if you have never lived on a failing station, may not sound like an improvement. It was a monumental one. Pell transformed under the process. By the 3rd week he no longer flinched when Vane predicted component failure before opening the housing. By the 4th, he had begun prefetching the correct tools based on the expression Vane made 2 seconds before identifying what was wrong. This, I think, is one of the quieter legacies competence leaves behind. It does not only solve the current problem. It alters the confidence of the people working nearby. The ceremony, when it came, was embarrassing in exactly the right way. Kestral's management office held it in the Deck 2 conference room, which had not been designed for gratitude and resisted the attempt visibly. There were 10 chairs, 3 functioning light strips, 1 projection wall that refused to align squarely with the table, and a nutrient tray arrangement that suggested the station believed recognition should be nutritionally complete but emotionally minimal. Horald Den read from a prepared statement. Dorvac attended, awake. Pell stood at the back trying not to look proud and failing. I remained near the door in my capacity as neutral observer and chronic witness to improbable outcomes. Elias Vane accepted a payment confirmation, a station certificate of infrastructure restoration, and a handshake from a man who had lost control of his own station years earlier and only now understood the shape of what that felt like. Vane thanked him. Not ironically. Not warmly either. Just correctly. Then he packed. 1 bag. Same as when he arrived. I found that strangely moving. Places like Kestral always imagine they are special in their brokenness while they are being repaired. It is one of the quieter narcissisms of damaged systems. Then the person doing the repair finishes, zips the same bag they brought in, and reminds you with one motion that your crisis was also someone else's Tuesday. He turned in his access credentials at 1600. Filed his final maintenance documentation at 1612. Left a complete follow-up service schedule with Pell at 1620. At 1628, he was walking toward Dock 4 with his bag over one shoulder and no visible sign that the previous month had contained anything to qualify as legend. I fell into step beside him. Not because I had planned a farewell. Because certain endings deserve witnesses. You're leaving immediately, I said. My next contract starts in 2 days. Where? Mining station near the Vale corridor. Water recycling failure. Backup system still holding. He said this the way people mention whether fronts they have already accepted must be crossed. Do you ever go anywhere that functions properly? He thought about it. No one hires me for the stations that function properly. That answer was so perfect to the man that I almost resented him for it. We walked in silence past the stabilized market lights, past a freight crew arguing under full brightness instead of intermittent gloom, past a ventilation grate that no longer exhaled burnt copper into the corridor every third cycle. The station was working. Not perfectly. Kestral would never be perfect. Perfection requires design, maintenance, money, and leadership, and while one competent engineer can help with the second, he cannot permanently compensate for the other 3. But it was working. That is a much more honest kind of victory. At the docking bay threshold, I said, "You understand you have altered the station." He adjusted the strap on his bag. "I fixed the grid. That is not the whole record." "No," he agreed. "But it's the part one was hired for." I looked at him. He looked back with that same mild, tired, impossibly stable expression I had spent a month trying to classify correctly. So I said the thing I had been constructing in fragments since day 3. "I have filed 48 incident reports," I told him. "Most of them summarize damage, negligence, or conflict. You are the first person I have considered describing as an environmental correction." That made him smile. A real smile. Brief, lopsided, unexpectedly alive. It changed his whole face. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," I said carefully, "that you appear to move through broken systems in a way that makes their excuses less durable." He considered that. Then nodded once, as if I had offered a technically acceptable description of a phenomenon he had long ago stopped finding surprising. "That seems fair." The shuttle crew signaled boarding. He turned toward the ramp. Then paused. "Deck 2 relay bank," he said. I frowned. "What about it?" "Annual inspection minimum. Preferably every 9 months. The casing discoloration near the left mount means someone's going to assume the thermal stress is cosmetic." "It isn't." "You're telling me?" "I'm telling whoever reads things." That, more than anything else, was Elias Vane. No flourish. No dramatic farewell. Just the note that might keep the place working after he was gone. He boarded. The hatch sealed. The second attempt disengaged from the clamps and backed cleanly out of the bay into the black between station and lane. I watched the running lights until they were too small to matter visually and, because I had by then learned something useful from him, kept watching another few seconds longer just in case. Then I turned back toward Kestral. The lights held steady all along the corridor. No flicker. No sag. No compensatory pulse every 14 seconds. Just working systems and the low hum of a station that, for the first time in years, no longer sounded like it was bargaining with failure. I filed my report 2 days later. It ran to 11 pages, which is obscene for my office and caused a review clerk in the regional compact hub to send me a polite inquiry asking whether the summary field might not have sufficed. I sent back the short version anyway. Human contractor arrived to repair distressed infrastructure. Completed full systems restoration ahead of schedule. Also identified and lawfully mapped an undeclared coercive commercial network as a function of doing the job correctly. Initiated no unnecessary conflict. Departed on time. Station functional at 94%. The clerk asked whether there were any cultural observations relevant to future contracting assessments. I thought about that for a long time. Then I wrote. The subject displayed no interest in heroics, status, or memory. He fixed what he was hired to fix, then fixed adjacent failures because they had become visible and were therefore, in his understanding, part of the same system. He did not consider this unusual. The station did. I almost ended there. Then I added one final note. On the wall near Dock 4, 2 days after his departure, someone had written in compact, precise standard script. 94% stable. Check relay bank on Deck 2 before annual load season. Do not ignore casing discoloration. No signature. Of course not. Just enough information for the next person. That is how the story should end. Not with applause. Not with a statue. Not with anyone finally understanding him completely. With a station running. With one merchant untouched. With one criminal ecosystem forced into retreat. With one junior tech now permanently ruined for incompetent management. With one neutral observer filing the longest report of his career. And with one quiet note on a wall from a man who had never wanted to be remembered, only to leave the system less broken than he found it.